The rain fell in sheets against the windows of Ravenshurst Manor, each drop a tiny hammer driving home the reality of what father had done. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the storm rage across the Yorkshire moors, and wondered if the tempest outside could ever match the one churning in her heart. "A horse," she whispered to her reflection, pale and ghost-like in the darkening glass. "He sold me for a horse. Not even a particularly fine horse, from what she'd overheard. A sturdy mare, brown and unremarkable, but strong enough to pull the plough through their failing fields. That was all she was worth to him, the price of survival for one more season." The door behind her opened with a creak that seemed to echo through the sparsely furnished room. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, entered with a tray of tea and bread. The woman's face was carved from granite, all sharp angles and disapproval, but Eleanor thought she detected something softer in her eyes. Pity, perhaps, or understanding born of witnessing too many such tragedies in this isolated corner of England. "You'll want to eat something, miss," Mrs. Pemberton said, setting the tray on the small table near the hearth. "His Grace keeps late hours, but he'll expect you presentable when he sends for you." Eleanor's stomach clenched. "When will that be?" "Tonight, I should imagine. Or tomorrow. He's unpredictable." The housekeeper paused at the door. "But not cruel, miss. Whatever stories you've heard about the Duke of Ashbourne, remember they're just stories. Half-lies, most likely, spread by those who fear what they don't understand." "And what don't they understand?" Mrs. Pemberton's lips pressed into a thin line. "That loneliness can make a man into a ghost long before death claims him." With that cryptic pronouncement, she was gone, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the untouched tea growing cold on the tray. Eleanor had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the village had. The Duke of Ashbourne, once the pride of Yorkshire society, had retreated to Ravenshurst Manor 7 years ago after some unnamed scandal in London. Some said he'd killed a man in a duel over a woman. Others whispered darker things, that he'd been cursed by a jealous mistress, that he practiced black arts in the manor's west wing, that he'd gone mad with grief after losing his young wife to childbed fever. The truth, Eleanor suspected, was probably far more mundane. But mundane or not, he was now her master, and she was here because her father had failed. Failed at farming, failed at managing their small estate, failed at everything except drinking away what little they had left. She remembered the conversation she'd overheard 3 days ago, pressed against the wall outside her father's study. "It's a fair trade, Hartley." That had been Mr. Wickham, the land agent. "The Duke needs a companion, someone to manage the household, perhaps provide him with an heir eventually. You need that mare to bring in the harvest, or you'll lose everything come winter." "She's my daughter, not a broodmare." Her father's voice had been thick with drink and desperation. "She's 19 and unmarried with no prospects. What future does she have here? At least at Ravenshurst she'll have a roof over her head, food in her belly, and maybe, if she plays her cards right, a title eventually. The Duke is only 32. He could live another 30 years or more." There had been a long silence, punctuated only by the clink of glass against glass. Then her father had spoken again, his voice hollow. "When would he want her?" "Before the week is out. He's sending a carriage." Eleanor had fled to her room then, had wept into her pillow until no more tears would come. But she had not protested when the carriage arrived, black as a hearse, drawn by 4 matching greys that looked far too fine for the muddy roads leading to their crumbling estate. She had not said good-bye to her father. She couldn't bear to look at him. She'd embraced her younger sister, Catherine, who had cried enough for both of them, and then she had climbed into the carriage like a prisoner mounting the scaffold. The journey had taken most of the day, winding deeper into the moors, away from anything resembling civilization. Ravenshurst Manor had appeared through the mist like something from a Gothic novel, all dark stone and narrow windows, towers that seemed to claw at the grey sky, and ground so overgrown that nature seemed intent on reclaiming what man had built. Now, as night fell fully and the storm continued its assault on the ancient building, Eleanor forced herself to eat some of the bread. She would need her strength for whatever came next. She was no fool. She understood what was expected of women in her position. The Duke had purchased her, essentially, and he would expect a return on his investment. The thought made her feel ill, but she pushed it aside. She had always been practical, even as a child. Practicality had helped her manage their household after Mother died. Practicality had taught her to stretch every penny, to make do with threadbare dresses and dinners of little more than potatoes and turnips. Practicality would see her through this as well. She was changing into the one decent nightgown she owned, a simple white cotton affair that had been her mother's, when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Heavy, measured steps that paused outside her door. Eleanor's heart began to race. She clutched the nightgown to her chest, not yet having put it on, still in her chemise and petticoats. But the footsteps moved on, fading into the distance. She released a breath she hadn't known she was holding and quickly finished dressing. The nightgown was too big for her smaller frame, making her look even younger than her 19 years. She brushed out her dark hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders as was proper for a woman in her bedchamber, and then she waited. And waited. The clock on the mantel ticked past 10, then 11. The fire burned low. Outside, the storm began to subside, the rain easing to a steady patter. Still, no one came. Finally, exhausted from the emotional turmoil of the day and the rocking of the carriage, Eleanor climbed into the large four-poster bed. The sheets were clean and smelled of lavender, the first luxury she'd experienced in years. Despite her anxiety, sleep claimed her almost immediately. She dreamed of horses running wild across the moors, their hooves striking sparks from the stones. And in the dream, she was running too, but whether she was chasing them or fleeing from something else, she couldn't tell. She woke to pale morning light filtering through the curtains and the sound of someone moving about the room. Mrs. Pemberton was stoking the fire, adding coals with practiced efficiency. "Good morning, miss," the housekeeper said without turning around. "I trust you slept well?" Yes." Eleanor sat up, pulling the covers around herself. "The Duke didn't send for me. His Grace was occupied with business matters late into the night. He asked that I inform you he will meet with you this morning, after you've broken your fast. There's water for washing in the basin, and I've laid out a dress for you. It was Her Grace's, the late Duchess, but you're of a similar size. His Grace thought you might want something suitable to wear until your own things can be made." Eleanor looked at the dress draped over the chair near the window. It was beautiful, far finer than anything she'd ever owned. Deep blue silk with black trim, modest but elegant. The sight of it made her throat tighten. This had belonged to the Duke's dead wife. What kind of man gave his purchased companion his late wife's clothing? "Thank you," she managed to say. Mrs. Pemberton nodded. "Breakfast will be served in the morning-room in half an hour. I'll send a maid to show you the way." She paused at the door. "A word of advice, miss. His Grace values honesty above all things. Don't simper or pretend. He's had enough of that from London society. Just be yourself." After the housekeeper left, Eleanor performed her ablutions and dressed in the blue silk. It fit remarkably well, though she had to adjust the laces herself. She studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The dress transformed her, made her look like someone of consequence rather than a farmer's desperate daughter. But her eyes betrayed her. They were wide with fear and uncertainty. "Be yourself," she whispered to her reflection. "As if I know who that is any more." The maid who came to fetch her was a young girl, perhaps 15, with red hair and a smattering of freckles across her nose. She introduced herself as Annie and chattered nervously as she led Eleanor through the winding corridors of Ravenshurst Manor. "It's ever so big, miss, but you'll learn your way about soon enough. That's the portrait gallery. We don't go in there much. And that leads to the West Wing, which is His Grace's private domain. Mrs. Pemberton says we're never to go there uninvited. Here's the main staircase. Mind the third step, it creaks something fierce. And down this way is the morning room. The morning room was considerably more cheerful than Eleanor had expected, with large windows overlooking a garden that, despite being overgrown, still held traces of former glory. A table was set with more food than Eleanor had seen in months. Fresh bread, butter, jam, eggs, kippers, and even fruit. She was helping herself to a modest portion when she heard footsteps behind her. Deep instinct made her turn, and she found herself face to face with the Duke of Ashbourne for the first time. He was not what she had expected. The rumors had painted him as either a dissolute rake or a decrepit recluse, but the man standing in the doorway was neither. He was tall, well-built, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes so dark they appeared almost black. His face was handsome in a harsh, angular way, but it was marked by deep lines of weariness and something else, pain, perhaps, or regret. He wore simple clothing, gentleman's attire, but nothing ostentatious, and he held himself with a rigid formality that suggested a man barely holding himself together. Miss Hartley. His voice was deep, cultured, with an edge of roughness as if he didn't use it often. I trust your accommodations are adequate? Eleanor set down her plate and curtsied, her heart hammering. Yes, Your Grace. Thank you. He moved into the room, but kept his distance, as if afraid to come too close. I apologize for not greeting you upon your arrival. I found myself unprepared for company. I understand, Your Grace. Do you? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I doubt that. Please, sit. Eat. We have matters to discuss, but they can wait until you've had breakfast. Eleanor sat, acutely aware of his eyes on her. He didn't eat, just poured himself coffee and stood by the window, looking out at the garden. You're younger than I expected, he said finally. Wickham assured me you were of age, but you look scarcely more than a child. I'm 19, Your Grace. Old enough to understand the nature of this arrangement. He turned to look at her then, really look at her, and she forced herself to meet his gaze despite the flush creeping up her neck. And what do you understand the nature of this arrangement to be, Miss Hartley? Eleanor took a breath. Honesty, Mrs. Pemberton had said. I understand that my father sold me to you in exchange for a horse. I understand that you expect something in return for that transaction. I'm here to fulfill whatever role you require of me. Something flickered across his face. Was it pain? Anger? She couldn't tell. Your father sold you, he repeated slowly. Yes, I suppose that's one way to view it. Here is how I view it, Miss Hartley. Your father was about to lose his land. His youngest daughter would have been thrown into the workhouse or worse. I offered him a solution that would save his farm and provide you with security. In return, I asked for companionship. Nothing more. Companionship. The word came out more skeptical than she'd intended. I have been alone in this house for 7 years, Miss Hartley. 7 years with no one to talk to but servants who fear me and neighbors who shun me. I am not looking for a mistress or a whore. I am looking for someone to dine with, to speak with, to remind me that I am still human and not simply a ghost haunting these halls. If you can provide that, then you will have fulfilled your obligation. Eleanor stared at him, trying to determine if he was telling the truth. You don't expect me to share your bed? I expect you to share my table and my conversation. Where you sleep is entirely your choice. He set down his coffee cup with a sharp click. I'm aware of what people say about me, Miss Hartley. I'm aware that you probably think I'm a monster. Perhaps I am. But I'm not the kind of monster who would force himself on an unwilling woman, no matter what I paid for her company. The relief that flooded through Eleanor was so intense it made her dizzy. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Don't thank me yet. You may find that dinner conversation with me is a worse fate than you imagined." He almost smiled. Almost. "Now, finish your breakfast. Then I'll show you the house and we'll discuss the terms of your stay here." Eleanor managed to eat a few more bites, though her appetite had fled. The Duke remained by the window, silent and brooding, until she finished. Then he offered her his arm, stiffly formal, and led her from the room. Ravenshurst Manor was enormous, a labyrinth of corridors and chambers that ranged from opulent to decrepit. The Duke showed her the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with books, dust motes dancing in the light from tall windows. He showed her the music room, where a pianoforte sat shrouded in cloth. He showed her the conservatory, where exotic plants struggled to survive in the English climate. "My mother's passion," he said, gesturing to a wilting orchid. "I don't have her talent for keeping things alive." They didn't go to the West Wing. He simply gestured toward it and said, "My private rooms. You're welcome there only by invitation." Finally, they returned to a small sitting room on the second floor. It was cozy, with comfortable furniture and shelves lined with books. A writing desk sat by the window. "This can be your space," the Duke said. "Use it as you wish. If you need anything, books, writing materials, needlework supplies, ask Mrs. Pemberton and it will be provided." Eleanor walked to the window. From here, she could see across the moors, rolling and empty to the horizon. "Why me, Your Grace? Surely there are women in society who would have accepted your suit. Why purchase a farmer's daughter?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because women in society want something from me. My title, my wealth, my connections. They see the Duke of Ashbourne, not Alexander Thorne. You, Miss Hartley, want nothing from me. You're here because you had no choice. That makes you the most honest person I'm likely to meet." "You want honesty? Then let me be honest, Your Grace. I'm terrified. I don't know how to be a companion to a duke. I don't know the first thing about your world. I can milk a cow and churn butter and mend clothes until my fingers bleed, but I can't make polite conversation about art or music or whatever it is the nobility discusses." He turned to face her fully, and for the first time she saw something like genuine emotion in his eyes. "Then we're well matched, Miss Hartley. Because I've forgotten how to make polite conversation about anything. We'll have to teach each other." Over the following weeks, an uneasy routine developed at Ravenshurst Manor. Eleanor spent her mornings in her sitting room, reading books from the library and writing letters to Catherine that she wasn't sure she'd ever send. She took walks in the overgrown gardens, and gradually began to see the beauty beneath the wildness. Roses that bloomed defiantly despite neglect, stone paths that wound through herb gardens gone to seed. The Duke, Alexander, as he'd asked her to call him in private, though she still couldn't quite manage it, kept largely to himself during the day. But each evening, they dined together in the smaller of the two dining rooms. At first, these meals were stilted affairs, punctuated by long silences and awkward attempts at conversation. But slowly, gradually, something shifted. It started with books. Eleanor mentioned that she was reading Ivanhoe, and Alexander's face had lit up with genuine interest. They'd spent an entire dinner discussing Scott's romanticism versus his historical accuracy. The next night, he brought her a different book, Frankenstein, and asked what she thought of Mary Shelley's prose. Books led to other topics. Eleanor found herself telling him about life on the farm, about the hard work and the small joys, a perfect sunrise, the first lamb of spring, Catherine's laughter. And slowly, haltingly, Alexander began to tell her about his life before Ravenshurst. He'd been happy once, he said. Married to Isabella, a woman of gentle disposition and kind heart. They'd been young, barely 20, but deeply in love. She'd gotten pregnant within the first year of marriage, and Alexander had been overjoyed at the prospect of fatherhood. But childbirth had claimed both Isabella and the baby. Alexander had been in London on business, had received the news by letter. By the time he'd returned to Yorkshire, both his wife and his son were buried in the family crypt. "I should have been there," he said one night, staring into his wine-glass. "I should have been holding her hand. Instead, I was at some pointless meeting about some pointless investment. I chose money over her, and she died alone." "You couldn't have known," Eleanor said softly. "Couldn't I?" The physician had concerns. He'd written to me, advised me to return home. I ignored him. I thought he was being overly cautious. Alexander drained his glass. After the funeral, I came to Ravenshurst. Isabella and I had spent our honeymoon here. Every room held memories of her. I thought I was coming here to remember her. Instead, I've been hiding. From what? From everything. From society. From responsibility. From the possibility of ever caring about anything again. He looked at her then, and Eleanor saw something vulnerable in his expression. From living. Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. She was only 19, and what did she know of grief and loss? But she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He stiffened at first, then slowly relaxed. They sat that way for a long moment, connected by that simple touch, while the candles burned low and the night grew deep around them. After that evening, something changed between them. Alexander began spending more time outside the West Wing. He joined Eleanor on her walks through the garden, and together they began the slow work of reclaiming it from nature. He showed her how to prune the roses, how to clear the paths without destroying the wildflowers that had seeded themselves between the stones. "Isabella loved this garden," he said one afternoon, cutting back an overgrown hedge. "She could spend hours out here. She knew every plant by name." "What was she like?" Eleanor asked. She'd been curious about the late Duchess but hadn't wanted to pry. Now, though, Alexander seemed ready to talk. Beautiful, but not in the conventional way. She had red hair and freckles, and she hated both. She laughed too loudly at parties and had opinions about everything from politics to poetry. Society thought she was too forward, too unrefined for a duchess. "I thought she was perfect." He paused in his work, leaning on the shears. "She would have liked you, I think. You remind me of her in some ways. The way you speak your mind, the way you're not afraid to challenge me." "I challenge you?" "Constantly. Yesterday you told me I was being melodramatic about the state of the East Garden. Last week you said my opinions on Byron were insufferably pretentious. No one has spoken to me like that in years." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "I apologize, Your Grace. I sometimes forget my place." "Don't." He said it sharply, then softened his tone. "Don't apologize for treating me like a human being rather than a title. That's why you're here, remember." As autumn deepened and the moors turned gold and russet, Eleanor found herself thinking less about her old life and more about her new one. Letters from Catherine told her that the farm was doing better. Father had brought in the harvest and paid off some debts. Catherine herself was being courted by the vicar's son, a development that filled Eleanor with both joy and a strange pang of loss. Life was moving on without her. But was that so terrible? Here at Ravenshurst she had comfort, security, and something she'd never had before. Time to think, to read, to be something more than a pair of hands to work. And she had Alexander, who had become something she'd never expected, a friend. They fell into an easy companionship. They read to each other in the library on rainy afternoons. They played chess in the evenings, and Eleanor discovered she had a talent for strategy that Alexander found both impressive and frustrating. They even made music together. Eleanor had a pleasant singing voice, and Alexander played the pianoforte with surprising skill and deep feeling. It was during one of these musical evenings that Mrs. Pemberton interrupted them, her face grave. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but there's a gentleman here to see you. A Mr. Lawrence Blackburn from London. He says it's urgent." Alexander's face went pale. "Blackburn? What the devil does he want?" "He wouldn't say, Your Grace. Only that it concerns your brother." Eleanor saw Alexander's hands clench on the edge of the pianoforte. "Show him to my study. I'll be there directly." After Mrs. Pemberton left, he turned to Eleanor. "I apologize. I must attend to this." "Of course. Is everything all right?" "I don't know. I haven't spoken to my brother in 7 years." He stood, then hesitated. "Eleanor, Miss Hartley, would you wait for me? I may need to talk afterward." It was the first time he'd called her by her given name. The intimacy of it sent a flutter through her chest. "Of course. I'll be in the library." She tried to read while she waited, but couldn't concentrate. More than an hour passed before Alexander appeared in the doorway of the library. His face was ashen, and he moved like a man who'd taken a blow. "Alexander." Eleanor set down her book and went to him. "What's happened?" "My brother, Richard. He's dead. Pneumonia. He died 3 weeks ago in London." Alexander's voice was flat, emotionless. "I'm not even sure why Blackburn thought to inform me. Richard and I were estranged. He sided with society after Isabella died, said I was wallowing in self-pity, told me to get over it and do my duty to the family name." "I'm so sorry." "Don't be." "I'm not. We weren't close, even as children." But his hands were shaking. "Blackburn says there are matters to settle. Richard's debts. He gambled away most of his inheritance. As the elder brother, his debts are now my responsibility." Eleanor guided him to a chair and poured him a brandy from the decanter on the side table. He drank it in one swallow. "There's more," he said. "Richard had a daughter, Amelia. She's 8 years old now. Her mother died years ago, and Richard left her in the care of a governess while he caroused in London. Blackburn says the governess is elderly and ill. Someone needs to take responsibility for the child." "What will you do?" "What can I do? She's my niece, my brother's child. I can't abandon her." He laughed bitterly. "Though God knows I'm hardly fit to be anyone's guardian. I can barely take care of myself." "That's not true," Eleanor said firmly. "You've taken care of me, haven't you? Provided me with everything I need. That's different. You're an adult. You don't need me to," he broke off, running his hands through his hair. "A child, Eleanor. How can I possibly raise a child in this mausoleum? What kind of life would that be for her?" Eleanor knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "A better life than she'd have in an orphanage or with distant relatives who don't want her. Alexander, you're a good man, a kind man. You've just forgotten how to believe that about yourself." He looked down at their joined hands, and when he met her eyes, there was something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "How did you become so wise? You're barely more than a girl yourself." "I've had to grow up quickly. And I've learned that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing." She squeezed his hands. "Bring Amelia here. Let Ravenshurst be a home for both of you. Let it be filled with life again instead of ghosts. And you," his voice was barely a whisper, "would you stay? Help me with her? I don't know the first thing about children. Neither do I, really. But we'll figure it out together." Something passed between them in that moment, something Eleanor couldn't quite name. Alexander lifted one of her hands to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Thank you," he said simply. Arrangements were made swiftly. Within a week, a carriage arrived bearing one small, frightened girl with her father's dark hair and eyes red from crying. Amelia Thorne clutched a worn doll and looked at Ravenshurst Manor as if it were a prison. Eleanor's heart broke for her. She knew what it was like to be sent away from everything familiar, to be thrust into a strange new life with no warning. "Hello, Amelia," Eleanor said gently, kneeling to be at eye level with the child. "My name is Eleanor. I live here too. Would you like to see your room? It has a lovely view of the garden." Amelia looked at her uncle, who stood stiffly in the entrance hall, clearly at a loss. Then she looked back at Eleanor and nodded slowly. Eleanor took her hand and led her upstairs, chattering about the house and the gardens and the books in the library. Behind them, she heard Alexander release a breath he'd been holding. That first night was difficult. Amelia cried for her governess, for her father, for everything she'd lost. Eleanor sat with her, holding her, letting her grieve. Alexander appeared in the doorway once, looking helpless, but Eleanor shook her head and he retreated. But by the second day, Amelia began to cautiously explore her new home. She discovered the library and was entranced by the sheer number of books. She found a family of mice living in the wall of the conservatory and insisted on leaving crumbs for them. And slowly, carefully, she began to warm to her uncle, especially when she discovered he could do magic tricks, simple sleight of hand that made her giggle. Eleanor watched Alexander with Amelia and saw him transform. The brooding, isolated Duke gave way to something gentler. He was patient with the child's questions, attentive to her needs, and slowly but surely, he began to smile more. Real smiles, not the bitter half-smiles Eleanor had grown accustomed to. As winter approached and the first snows dusted the moors, Ravenshurst Manor began to feel like something it hadn't been in years. A home. Eleanor and Amelia spent their days together. Eleanor taught the girl her letters and numbers, read to her, played with her. They baked with the cook, who was delighted to have a child in the house again. They explored the attics and found trunks full of old clothes that they used to play dress-up. And in the evenings, the three of them would gather in the small sitting-room. Alexander, Eleanor, and Amelia. Alexander would read aloud from books of fairy tales while Amelia sat on Eleanor's lap, and somewhere in those quiet domestic moments, something shifted in Eleanor's heart. She was falling in love with him. It crept up on her gradually, in small moments. The way he smiled when Amelia laughed. The way he looked at Eleanor across the dinner table, as if she were the most interesting person in the world. The brush of his hand against hers when they both reached for the same book. The sound of his voice reading poetry in the library. She tried to fight it. He was a duke, and she was, what? A purchased companion? A glorified servant? Whatever she was, she certainly wasn't suitable to be a duchess. Society would never accept her. And more than that, she wasn't sure Alexander felt the same way. He was kind to her, yes. He'd come to depend on her, certainly. But love? The question tormented her through the long winter nights. Christmas came, and Alexander insisted on celebrating it properly for Amelia's sake. They decorated the house with holly and ivy. Cook made a proper Christmas pudding. Alexander even found a Yule log for the great hall's enormous fireplace, and they lit it on Christmas Eve with appropriate ceremony. Amelia was enchanted. She'd never had a proper Christmas before. Her father had been too dissolute, too focused on his own pleasures. Now she had presents and sweets and a family, however odd that family might be. On Christmas morning, after Amelia had opened her gifts and rushed off to play with her new dolls, Alexander presented Eleanor with a small wrapped package. "You didn't need to," she started, but he shook his head. "Open it." Inside was a book. But not just any book, a first edition of Pride and Prejudice, one of Eleanor's favorites. The book she'd mentioned loving months ago, in one of their early dinner conversations. "Alexander, this is too much. This must have cost. It cost what it cost. I wanted you to have it." He paused, then added quietly, "You've given me so much more than a book, Eleanor. You've given me back my life. You and Amelia both. I was barely existing before you came here. Now I'm living again." Eleanor's throat tightened. "I was just doing what you asked. Being a companion." "No." He stepped closer, and Eleanor's heart began to race. "You've been so much more than that. You've been my friend, my ally, my salvation." His hand came up to cup her cheek, and Eleanor found herself leaning into the touch. "Eleanor, I know what our arrangement was. I know I have no right to ask for more. But these past months— Uncle Alexander— Eleanor, come see. It's snowing again." Amelia's voice rang out from the hall, and the moment shattered. Alexander dropped his hand and stepped back, and Eleanor felt the loss of his warmth like a physical ache. They spent the rest of the day playing in the snow with Amelia, building a snowman on the front lawn and having a snowball fight that left all three of them soaked and laughing. But Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about what Alexander had been about to say. What had he been about to ask for? That night, after Amelia was tucked into bed, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and wandered the halls of Ravenshurst, ending up in the library. She wasn't surprised to find Alexander there, staring into the fire. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked without turning around. "Too much excitement today, I think." Eleanor moved to stand beside him. "Alexander, earlier today, you were going to say something." Before Amelia interrupted. He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes, I was." He turned to face her, and in the firelight, his expression was unguarded. "Eleanor, when you came here, I told you I wanted companionship. Nothing more. And you've given me that, more generously than I had any right to expect. But somewhere along the way, my feelings changed. I've grown to care for you. Deeply." Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "I've grown to care for you too. Have you? Truly? Or do you simply feel obligated because of our arrangement?" He searched her face. "I need to know the truth, Eleanor. Because if there's any chance you might feel the same way I do, then I need to ask you something. But if you don't, if you're here only out of duty, then I'll never mention it again, and we can continue as we have been. What do you want to ask me?" He took both her hands in his. "Marry me. Not as part of some transaction. Not because your father sold you for a horse. But because I love you. Because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because you've made me believe I deserve happiness again. Marry me, Eleanor Hartley, and make me the happiest man in England." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm not a lady. I have no dowry, no connections. Society will never accept me as your duchess. To hell with society. I've spent 7 years caring what society thinks, and it's brought me nothing but misery. All I care about now is you. Do you love me, Eleanor?" "Yes." The word came out as barely a whisper, but it was enough. "Yes, I love you. I've loved you for months, but I was afraid to say anything. I thought you saw me as a child, or a servant, or—" He cut her off with a kiss, gentle at first, then deepening as Eleanor wrapped her arms around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I see you as the woman who saved me," Alexander murmured against her hair. "The woman who brought light back into this dark house. The woman I want to spend the rest of my life with." He pulled back to look at her. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Eleanor said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, yes, yes." They were married in the village church 6 weeks later, with only a handful of people in attendance: Mrs. Pemberton, the servants, Amelia in her best dress, and Catherine, who had travelled from home for the occasion. Eleanor wore the blue silk dress she'd worn that first morning at Ravenshurst, and Alexander wore black with a white cravat, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Amelia cheered so loudly it echoed through the small church. The wedding breakfast was held at Ravenshurst, and as Eleanor looked around at the faces of the people she'd come to care for, she felt a profound sense of peace. This was her family now. This was her home. That night, after the guests had departed and Amelia was finally asleep despite her excitement, Alexander led Eleanor to the west wing, his private rooms that she'd never been invited to enter before. "I've been preparing these rooms," he said as he opened the door. "I had them redecorated. I wanted them to be ours, not mine. A fresh start." The rooms were beautiful, a suite of chambers that included a sitting room, a bedroom, and even a small study. The walls had been painted a soft cream, and new furniture had been brought in. But what caught Eleanor's attention was the portrait that hung above the fireplace in the sitting room. It was Isabella. She had red hair and freckles, just as Alexander had described, and she was laughing in the painting, her head thrown back with joy. "I want her here," Alexander said softly. "Is that all right? I loved her, and I'll always love her. But that doesn't diminish what I feel for you. You're not a replacement for her, Eleanor. You're something entirely your own. I want to honor both, my past and my future." Eleanor looked at the portrait, at Isabella's joyful face, and felt no jealousy. Instead, she felt grateful to this woman she'd never met, grateful that she'd loved Alexander and been loved by him, grateful that he'd known happiness once and could find it again. "She's beautiful," Eleanor said, "and I'm glad she's here. She's part of your story, Alexander. That means she's part of ours too." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How did I ever deserve you? You paid a horse for me," she said with a small smile. "I'd say you got a bargain." He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that filled the room with warmth. "The best bargain I ever made." Their wedding night was tender and sweet. Alexander was patient with Eleanor's nervousness, gentle with her inexperience. He worshipped her with his hands and lips, murmuring words of love and devotion until her fear melted away and was replaced by wonder and pleasure. When they finally came together, it felt not like an obligation or a duty, but like the natural conclusion of months of growing closeness and deepening love. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the large bed, Eleanor's head resting on Alexander's chest as he stroked her hair. "Tell me something," Eleanor said softly. "That day when Wickham came to my father with your offer, why did you really do it? What made you think of such an arrangement?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, his hand stilling in her hair. "Do you remember I told you about the physician's letter? The one I ignored when Isabella was pregnant?" "Yes. After she died, I found all her letters. She'd written me dozens while I was in London, but I'd been too busy to read most of them thoroughly. In one, she mentioned feeling unwell, mentioned her worries about the pregnancy. She asked me to come home, and I didn't. I was too focused on business, on money, on proving myself as a duke." His voice was rough with old pain. "When I finally read that letter, months after her death, I realized that I'd become exactly what I despised, a man who valued wealth and status over the people he loved." He took a shaky breath. "I retreated here, to Ravenshurst, and I told myself I was grieving. But really, I was punishing myself. I didn't deserve happiness. I didn't deserve love. I deserved to be alone with my guilt. But 7 years is a long time to live with ghosts, Eleanor. And one day, I looked in the mirror and saw that I'd become one myself. I was barely alive." "So you asked Wickham to find someone?" "I asked him to find me a reason to rejoin the world. Someone who would have no expectations of me, no demands. Someone who wouldn't know the Duke of Ashbourne, only Alexander Thorne. He told me about your father's situation, and something about it resonated with me. A desperate man trying to save his family, a daughter willing to sacrifice herself for them. It seemed honest, raw, real. Everything my life in London had never been. Eleanor propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. You wanted honesty, and I certainly gave you that. I told you exactly what I thought of your Byron opinions. He smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. You did. And it was glorious. No one had spoken to me like a real person in years. You were frightened, yes, but you weren't obsequious. You didn't try to manipulate or seduce me. You were just yourself. And somewhere between that first awful breakfast and now, I fell completely in love with you. I fell in love with you when you were trying to prune that rose bush, Eleanor confessed. You got so frustrated with it, swearing at the thorns, and then you laughed at yourself. It was the first time I'd seen you really laugh, and I thought, oh, there he is. There's the real man underneath all that grief and isolation. A rose bush, Alexander mused. How decidedly unromantic. I think it's perfectly romantic. You were trying to bring beauty back into the garden, back into your life. How could I not love you for that? He kissed her then, slow and deep, and when he pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making you happy, Eleanor Thorne. That's a promise. And I'm going to hold you to it, she said, smiling. Starting with breakfast in bed tomorrow. I'm absolutely famished. He laughed and pulled her close again, and they fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the portrait of Isabella watching over them with her forever frozen smile. The months that followed were the happiest Eleanor had ever known. She settled into her role as Duchess of Ashbourne with surprising ease, though she steadfastly refused to put on airs or pretend to be something she wasn't. When the local gentry came to call, cautiously at first, curious about the Duke's sudden marriage, she greeted them in her straightforward manner and won them over with her genuine warmth and lack of pretension. "You're not at all what we expected," Lady Thornbury said one afternoon during tea. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, the acknowledged leader of local society. "We heard His Grace had married some. Well, never mind what we heard. But you're quite refreshing, my dear. No London airs about you." "That's because I've never been to London," Eleanor said cheerfully. "And I have no intention of acquiring airs from anywhere else either. I'm quite content being exactly who I am." Lady Thornbury had laughed at that and declared Eleanor a breath of fresh air. Within weeks, the local families had accepted her, and invitations began arriving for dinners and gatherings. Alexander had been reluctant at first. 7 years of isolation had made him wary of society. But Eleanor coaxed him back into the world, and found that together they could handle anything. Amelia thrived in her new life. She adored Eleanor, whom she'd taken to calling Aunt Eleanor, and sometimes, when she was very happy, just Mama. The first time she'd said it, she'd clapped her hand over her mouth, horrified that she'd been disrespectful to her real mother's memory. But Eleanor had knelt down and taken her hands. "Amelia, I never knew your mother, but I'm sure she loved you very much. And I'm equally sure she would want you to be happy and loved. If calling me Mama makes you happy, then you should do it. It would make me very happy too." Amelia had burst into tears and thrown herself into Eleanor's arms, and from that day forward Eleanor was Mama and Alexander was Papa, and they were a family in every way that mattered. Spring came to the moors, bringing with it wild flowers and new life. The garden at Ravenshurst, tended now with love and care, burst into bloom. Eleanor discovered she was pregnant in April, and Alexander had wept when she told him. Tears of joy and perhaps a little fear, given what had happened with Isabella. But Eleanor was strong and healthy, and Dr. Fernsby, the local physician, assured them both that there was no cause for concern. "I won't leave you," Eleanor told Alexander one night when she caught him watching her with worried eyes. I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me for a very long time, Your Grace. Promise me, he said, his voice rough. Promise me you'll tell me immediately if anything feels wrong. Promise me you won't hide anything from me. I promise. On one condition. You promise to stop treating me like I'm made of glass. I'm growing a baby, not dying of consumption. He'd laughed at that, but she could see the fear still lingered. So she made a point of including him in everything, letting him feel the baby kick, discussing names, planning the nursery. Slowly, his fear gave way to excitement. In October, on a crisp autumn morning when the moors were painted in shades of gold and amber, Eleanor gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Alexander was there throughout the labor, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect, Alexander cut the cord with shaking hands and then sat beside Eleanor's bed, cradling his son with a look of such profound wonder and joy that Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "We have a son," he whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Eleanor, we have a son. What shall we call him?" Alexander looked down at the tiny face, then back at Eleanor. "I'd like to name him Thomas, after my father. But only if you agree." "Thomas Thorne," Eleanor said, testing the name. "It's perfect. Hello, little Thomas. Welcome to Ravenshurst." Amelia, allowed into the room shortly after, was enchanted with her baby cousin. She insisted on helping with everything, fetching nappies, singing lullabies, even attempting to help with feedings until she realized that was exclusively her aunt's domain. "He's so small," she whispered, gently touching Thomas's tiny hand. "Was I ever that small?" "You were," Alexander said, putting his arm around her. "And look how big and strong you've grown. Thomas will too, especially with a wonderful cousin like you to watch over him." Amelia beamed with pride, and Eleanor felt her heart might burst with love for this strange, wonderful family they'd created. That winter, as snow blanketed the moors once again, Eleanor stood at the window of the nursery, holding Thomas while he slept. Behind her, she could hear Alexander reading to Amelia in the sitting-room, his deep voice weaving through the fairy tale with dramatic flair that made the girl giggle. She thought about where she'd been just over a year ago, a frightened girl arriving at a dark manor, sold for the price of a horse, with no idea what her future held. She thought about how terrified she'd been, how certain that her life was over. But her life hadn't ended at Ravenshurst. It had begun. She'd found love in the last place she'd expected it. She'd found family, purpose, and happiness. She'd found herself. The door opened behind her, and Alexander came in, wrapping his arms around her and Thomas both. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured against her hair. "About horses," she said with a smile. "And how sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the best ones." "Cryptic as always, my love. Care to elaborate?" She turned in his arms, careful not to wake the baby. "My father sold me for a horse. At the time, I thought it was the end of everything. But really, it was the beginning. If he hadn't been so desperate, if you hadn't been so lonely, if circumstances hadn't conspired to bring us together, we wouldn't have this. Any of this." Alexander's eyes grew tender. "Are you saying you're grateful your father traded you for livestock?" "I'm saying I'm grateful for every twist of fate that led me to you. Even the painful ones. Especially the painful ones, perhaps. Because they taught me that sometimes we have to lose everything before we can find what we're really looking for." "And what were you looking for, Eleanor Thorne?" She kissed him softly. "I didn't know at the time. But I know now. I was looking for home. And I found it here, with you." Thomas stirred in her arms, making small snuffling noises. Amelia appeared in the doorway, holding her doll. "Is Thomas awake? Can I hold him, Mama? I'll be very careful." "Of course, darling." Eleanor settled into the rocking chair and helped Amelia climb up beside her, carefully arranging the baby in the girl's arms while keeping her own hands ready to help. Alexander stood watching them, and Eleanor caught the expression on his face, love and contentment and a deep, abiding peace. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For saving me. For loving me. For giving me this family, this life. For being brave enough to see past the monster everyone thought I was." "You were never a monster, Alexander. Just a man who'd forgotten how to live. But we all forget sometimes. The important thing is that you remembered." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Ravenshurst Manor in white. But inside, in the nursery lit by firelight and filled with the people she loved most in the world, Eleanor felt nothing but warmth. She thought again about that day she'd arrived, terrified and alone, watching the storm rage across the moors. She'd thought the tempest in her heart could never be calmed. But she'd been wrong. Hearts, she'd learned, were more resilient than she'd ever imagined. They could break and heal stronger than before. They could open to love even when every instinct screamed to build walls. They could find hope in the darkest places. "Mama, Thomas is smiling at me." Amelia's delighted whisper broke through Eleanor's reverie. "That's because he knows he has the best big cousin in all of England," Eleanor said, smoothing back Amelia's dark hair. Alexander knelt beside the chair, his hand resting on Eleanor's shoulder. They stayed that way for a long time, the four of them, a family forged not by blood alone but by choice and love and the courage to take a chance on happiness. Years later, when Thomas was old enough to ask questions, he would want to know how his parents met. And Eleanor would tell him the truth, or at least part of it. She would tell him about a lonely duke and a frightened girl, about a manor on the moors that had been more graveyard than home, and about how love could bloom even in the unlikeliest soil. She would tell him about courage and second chances and the beauty of broken things made whole. But she would not tell him about the horse. That detail, she and Alexander agreed, could remain their secret, a private reminder that sometimes the worst bargains turn into the greatest blessings, and that the price we think we're paying is never the true cost of happiness. The true cost, Eleanor had learned, was vulnerability. It was the courage to open your heart even when you were terrified. It was the willingness to let go of who you thought you should be and embrace who you actually were. It was the strength to love without guarantees, to hope without certainty, to live without armor. And it was worth every penny. As Thomas grew into a lively, curious boy, and as Amelia blossomed into a thoughtful young woman, and as Eleanor and Alexander grew old together in their manor on the moors, they would look back on that cold November day when a frightened girl arrived in a black carriage, and they would marvel at how far they'd come. Ravenshurst Manor, once a place of ghosts and grief, had become a home filled with laughter and light. The gardens bloomed brighter every year. The halls rang with children's voices and music and joy. The library, once a sanctuary for isolation, became a gathering place where the family would spend countless evenings reading together and arguing amiably about poetry and philosophy. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the children were asleep, Eleanor and Alexander would sit by the fire in their sitting room, underneath Isabella's portrait, and talk about everything and nothing. About the past and the future. About their hopes and fears. About the ordinary magic of everyday life together. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked once, years into their marriage. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if your father hadn't made that bargain?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I think I would have survived. I would have found a way. But I wouldn't have lived, not really. I would have been like you were when I first came here, existing but not truly alive. So no, I don't regret it. Not for a single moment. Even though you had no choice?" "I had a choice," Eleanor said firmly. "Maybe not about coming here, but about everything that came after. I chose to see beyond your isolation to the man underneath. I chose to open my heart even though I was terrified. I chose to love you. and those choices made all the difference. He took her hand and raised it to his lips, his eyes shining with emotion. "I love you, Eleanor Thorne. More today than yesterday, and less than I will tomorrow." "That's terribly sentimental, Your Grace." "I'm a terribly sentimental man." "You're stuck with me." "For better or worse," Eleanor agreed, smiling. "Though mostly for better, I think." "Mostly," he said with a laugh, pulling her into his arms. And as they sat together in the firelight, wrapped in each other's embrace, Eleanor thought about the strange and winding path that had brought them here. She thought about fear and courage, about loss and love, about the way life could surprise you when you least expected it. She had been sold for a horse, a transaction that should have marked the end of her freedom, her hopes, her dreams. Instead, it had been the beginning of everything. And if someone had told that frightened 19-year-old girl, standing at the window of Ravenshurst Manor on that stormy November night, that one day she would be grateful for what her father had done, she would never have believed them. But life, Eleanor had learned, was full of impossible things that somehow became possible. Full of darkness that transformed into light. Full of loneliness that gave way to love. And sometimes, just sometimes, the worst things that happen to us turn out to be the best things in disguise. All it takes is courage to see the blessing hidden in the curse, and the wisdom to embrace it when it comes.